because I don't care what the thing is called. It just needs to exist and be callable. Open curly brace, and it's a little messy, but here is the other curly brace, close parenthesis. So it's starting to get a little hard to read, but notice open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open paren, open curly, close paren. So everything else is inside of this anonymous function. What is inside of this anonymous function? Turns out I'm doing the same kind of trick in the next line. $, quote unquote, sharp demo. So those of you familiar very well with CSS, this represents what? It's a CSS selector for the node whose ID is demo. So the hash sign means give me the node whose ID is demo. If you instead had .demo, that means give me the node that has a class of demo, and there's some other selectors as well. But this one means give me the one node whose ID is demo. .submit, they've simplified the wording, and jQuery does more than this, but rather than call it onSubmit, it's just called submit. And what does the submit function expect as its argument? It expects its own function, an anonymous function that it's going to kind of tuck away and call only when what happens? That element's submit handler is needed. So this is just a third and final way of associating an action, an event handler, a function, with an event, like form submission. So what happens next? Finally, it's boring again. Alert, hello, so-and-so. And in fact, I'm cheating here, or I'm mixing my syntax. What should this line 11 really be if I go into that code? Let me open up Notepad again, open up DOM2, and based on that lesson learned, what can I actually change this to? $, and hash name. So that's what I mean in part by jQuery simplifying otherwise fairly verbose code. Document.get element by ID can literally be summarized as $, because the jQuery function $, knows that when it's passed an argument that's not a global variable like document, which just gets immediately wrapped with a bigger rectangle, when it realizes, oh, this is a string, but this string starts with a hash sign, it knows that that means the rest of the word is the ID for a node in my DOM. So here again is just how jQuery simplifies our life, even though at first glance it absolutely looks more cryptic, but really it's ultimately saving us time. And again, we could factor out that code further into a JS file so that it doesn't even appear anywhere in our raw HTML. Whew.
Is that required for if you have a unique ID? Two IDs have the same ID?
Good question. Is it required to have a unique ID? It is a error of syntax for you to give two elements in a web page the same ID.
So if I give them the same ID, what do I have?
Well, you might get back, I don't know offhand, you might get back an array of two or more nodes, but I think it's fair to say, and I think the spec probably says the behavior is undefined, certainly for a JavaScript library, but I don't know offhand. Other questions? Yeah. No longer. It's not quite that. It's just, this is literally the honor system. Like for the web to work, all of us have to agree on some rules. And one of those rules is do not screw up and give two elements in a web page the same ID. And if you do, we're not sure what's going to happen. At least I'm not sure. There might be some formal definition. I'll look it up later tonight.
You have two elements with the same class.
That's fine. If you have two elements with the same class, you'll get back an array. And the following function will be applied to that array effectively. Even though it's not quite an array, it's in a wrapper that jQuery returns. OK. All right, so not bad. But thus far, all we're doing is manipulating DOM elements. It would be nice to start introducing some functionality. So why don't we go ahead and introduce a bit of storage capabilities? So where we left off, we had this thing here. And let's jump ahead to, I'm getting much better at this, local storage. So where can you store information in a browser when programming in JavaScript? Some of you might know from past experience, or now that you know JavaScript runs client-side, you have very few options to begin with. In window. So there's this global object called window that in theory you can store data in. But if that window closes, for instance, the browser quits, what happens to any variables you've tucked away there? They disappear. And this is what a lot of popular libraries do. They'll tuck important stuff in the window object. It's effectively making something a global variable, but it's not persistent. So where else can you put it? Obviously, the answer is going to be local storage. But leading up to local storage, where else can you put it? Cookies. So you can actually write JavaScript code to plant cookies on the user's computer that didn't come from the server. They came from your local JavaScript code. But what's the downside of using cookies? Correct. There's a size limit, which is generally pretty small, and they also can sometimes be disabled by users. They might not persist as long as intended if you're in incognito mode and the like. So there's a number of reasons where cookies get tripped off. And we're not going to solve all of those problems, but those are a couple of barriers. What else? If you have a server, you could just put it in a database, certainly. But maybe that's not ideal, especially if you're trying to make a mobile app that is fast by using local data as much as possible. So it turns out that local storage is a relatively new feature, popular in HTML5, that gives you access to another global variable, really inside the window, that is called local storage, capital S. And it has a few methods associated with it, among which are clear, which means just clear out anything I've put there already. Get item, which means give me the value of an item with a certain key. So get item takes one argument, a string, which is the identifier of whatever you put there. So for those familiar, local storage is a hash table, or it's a dictionary, or it's any number, an associative array. It can be thought of as any number of these things. Remove item does the opposite of set item, because set item takes two arguments, a key and a value, and it stores it locally in the browser. The upside of which is if you close the window, quit the browser, and don't clear the history in the computer, in the browser entirely, it's still going to be there later. So why might this be useful? Storing things like your address book for auto-completion, storing things like your inbox potentially if it's a mail application, storing a non-trivial amount of data for easy, ready access. So let's take a quick look at an example involving storage. So if we go back to today's sample code in storage.html, I have apparently visited this page 0 times. All right, if I dismiss this alert, reload this page, I have now visited this page 1 time before. All right, can guess where this is going. Reload the page 2 times before, but we just cited any number of ways where we could be storing the number 2, and then the number 3, and the number 4. It could be in a var, a variable, in the web page itself. So this isn't all that interesting. But let me go ahead and copy the URL so I don't have to remember what it was. Open a new browser window, save. Ooh, 3. It actually remembered this time. Let's play with fire. Quit the browser, reload it, visit it again. 4 times. So something is persisting. And it turns out it's relatively easy to actually implement this. If we look at the source of this page, I really kind of cut some corners on the aesthetics of the page. There's nothing actually there other than code. If we go in here and scroll down to the bottom of the page, notice that the HTML is super simple. We've got a title, a head, and a body, and then another HTML attribute. Not the only way to do this. And again, this is kind of a regression to the messier way, but it keeps the code super simple and the focus on the new stuff for now. What happens when the body is loaded, apparently? Call the greet function. So onload is like onSubmit, but it's when the body of the page is loaded. So now if we look up here, we have a bunch of lines of JavaScript code. It's a little more complex, but notice there's not much more in the head, just that familiar meta tag. And now the function called greet, what does it do? So a little new syntax here. So there's a few ways to do this, but a really rigorous way to check whether or not a variable exists in JavaScript is to take the symbol's name, in this case local storage, capital S, pass it to the type of operator, and type of is literally going to return a string whose value is number, or string, or bool, or undefined, if that variable has not yet been defined or set. So I'm literally checking for that. If the type of local storage is quote unquote undefined, then what is the implication? Or rather, is not undefined. Not undefined. But it looks like I made a typo here. Not equals equals. Feels like there's one too many equals for most languages. But it turns out that JavaScript, like some languages, does actually support different numbers of equal signs in certain contexts. Let me open the same file with TextEdit just so I can tweak some things. Zoom in here. You probably would have expected me to type this. And that it would actually work correctly too in all cases. But it's not quite as rigorous as doing this. Does anyone know what it means when you do not equals equals? Or, if easier to answer the other way, what this would mean, equals equals equals? Same instance, not quite same instance, but same value and same type. So JavaScript, as I mentioned earlier, does have disparate types, even though you, the programmer, don't specify them when declaring variables. So you don't say string, you don't say int, you don't say float. You just have access to those disparate data types. When I check the type of local storage and I say not equals equals, this is making sure that not only is the return value of type of not equal to quote unquote string, it is also at least a string itself. This is, in retrospect, a bad example because there's no instance in which this could go awry. A better example, and I'll think of one in the future, is that if I were checking the return value of some function and it could return null, for instance, but maybe it could return 0, those two values are often conflated. If you want to check a function's return value that could return null or could return 0, you can't rely on equals equals because they will implicitly cast to one another. Null is the same as 0. But if you want to check that the return value of some function is really, really null or really, really 0, not just some implicit equivalent, then you use equals equals equals. Or if you want to check the opposite, you use bang equals equals. So I apologize. This wasn't a good way to introduce that story. We'll fix it in the video.
So you're combining like multiple attributes?
Combining multiple characteristics, let's say, sure, of the values you're checking, both of the storage container you're checking, both its value and its type. Long story short, getting into this habit is not a bad thing because it means your code will never be vulnerable to those random corner cases where maybe two values could cast to the same thing. The number 1 could cast to true, the number 2 could cast to true, but true is true if you use the identity operator in this way. OK, let's not get too hung up on that and instead move on to this. Same trick as before, but let's just take for granted now that if type of local storage, open bracket, close quote, quote unquote, counter is undefined, what's the implication? So let's try to rewind this. This just says if the type of local storage is not undefined, that is equivalent logically to saying is local storage defined? Because if it is, I'm using a modern browser, supports HTML5, and therefore clearly supports local storage. This one line of code is only checking, does your browser support local storage? Second line is checking not whether local storage is supported, but specifically whether what is the case. Is there a variable called counter inside of local storage? So local storage is, again, a hash table, a dictionary, an associative array, a key value storage mechanism, however you want to think of it. This is just saying if we have never before defined a value for quote unquote counter, what do I want to initialize its value to, apparently? I want to just give it a value of 0. So this just means if this is the first time the person's ever visited the site, obviously local storage isn't even going to know that I care about a variable called counter, so let's make that exist and assign it the value of 0. Then let's trigger that alert. You have visited this many times, and then what do? Increment it again. So this just ensures that that one-time corner case is covered. Else down here, your browser does not support local storage is what happens if it is, in fact, undefined. So where am I actually storing the value? Well, I'm not actually using set item or get item. It actually suffices just to use this array notation. So this is because local storage itself is an object, and we can treat it as though it's an array with this square bracket notation, syntactic sugar, if you will. But in this case here, we're setting the value, and in this case here, we're setting the value as well by just doing a traditional plus plus. All right. So why might that be useful? Storing user preferences, potentially, or other things where you might want to remember some details about the user without having to query the server again and again for the same answer. All right. If you switch the browser, in what sense?
Like you open the Safari to open the same HTTP.
Oh, good question. That won't work. This is browser specific. So if I visit the page in Chrome, I get local storage within Chrome. If I then open Safari, Safari and has its own local storage container for me. It does not propagate across browsers. Yeah?
Are there limits to how much data you can store locally?
There is. I don't remember the value offhand. It's much bigger than a cookie, but not infinite, if that helps. That will be my other mental note to check, and as RJ is probably reminding me now. Yeah.
Use it easily remove this local storage, delete just like cookies, like cache.
Yes.